A man who turned ordinary human fear into the most dangerous weapon in his world steps into a galaxy where fear is currency for ancient gods. The air here does not smell of rain or city streets. It tastes of ash and the static of a billion prayers uttered by people who knew nothing was listening. He has no powers, no divine bloodline, only the absolute refusal to become the darkness he has spent his life fighting. Warhammer 40,000 has been waiting 10,000 years for something it could not break. Commorragh does not have a sky. It has a ceiling of stolen light. Arc lanterns powered by the slow death of captive stars hang at intervals vast enough that the darkness between them contains its own weather. The city fills the webway like a parasite that has spent 10 millennia perfecting its fit, its architecture constructed on the ruins of structures the Drukhari killed to make room for their own ambitions, spire rising above spire in configurations that mathematics evolved in the materium cannot fully describe. Whole districts hang suspended on chains as thick as hive-hab blocks. Palace towers dangle inverted above arenas the size of continents. The webway's walls, where they are visible through the layers of construction above and below, glow with a cold and ancient radiance that predates the civilization currently feeding on the space it provides. Commorragh is not a city in any sense that requires people to want to be there. It is a machine, the most sophisticated pain conversion apparatus in the galaxy, running without pause and without mercy, and without the concept of sufficient, because the hunger it feeds is written into the physics of what the Drukhari are rather than into their appetites, and physics does not stop when you have had enough. At any given moment, 30 million souls are screaming somewhere in its depths. This is not metaphor, this is ecology. The Drukhari do not age, they do not sleep, not truly, not in any metabolic sense that an Imperium Medicae would recognize. What they do, with the focused precision of a species that has spent 10,000 years refining the only remaining mechanism between them and the god that was born from their pleasure and that has been hungry for them ever since, is harvest. Every scream, every spike of anguish, every moment of pure and unfiltered terror drawn from a living nervous system fills the wound in their souls and slows the bleeding. The fall shattered the Eldari civilization, and in shattering, it tore a hole in every soul that survived, a hole that drains constantly toward she who thirsts. Suffering plugs it. There is no other way. The Drukhari did not choose this. They chose to survive it. These are different choices, and Commorragh is the consequence of the second. Velixar Kine had been watching the dimensional resonance near the Sol system for 17 years before it finally did something worth noting. He was old enough that the precise number of years he had existed had become more philosophical than practical. He had outlasted 3 Archons who had each believed, at various points, that they possessed sufficient leverage over the prophets of the sevenfold wound to dictate terms. He had outlasted 2 witch cult purges, 1 incursion of chaos that had taken an entire district of the city screaming into the warp, and a succession crisis in the cabal of the shattered obsidian that had ended with the previous Archon's remains displayed in a manner that his successor, Ysendra, had chosen not to investigate. Velixar was not powerful in the Archon's fashion, which was to say through violence, political maneuvering, and the specific leverage that comes from being willing to do the next terrible thing. He was powerful in the fashion of a man who has spent centuries collecting knowledge, which is to say, absolutely and permanently, and in ways that other kinds of power do not comprehend until it is too late. His resonance detectors had flagged the Sol system 17 years ago when a research team at a company called Wayne Enterprises first introduced a controlled micro-breach into a webway access corridor, achieving this through a combination of stolen pre-imperial mathematics and materials whose origin the researchers themselves could not fully account for. The breach lasted 0.3 seconds and produced a dimensional echo that Velixar's instruments read as the calling card of a civilization that was, by 40K standards, approximately 11,000 years behind the curve. He had watched their subsequent experiments with the patience and mild amusement of a scholar observing children attempt to pick a lock with the wrong tools. He had made projections, he had built models, He had, over the course of 17 years, constructed something of his own. He had been waiting for the right breach to give it a target. The resonator tore through, on a night that Commorragh classified as a night only because the arc lanterns in the sub-corridors cycled their light downward. The breach opened not in the sky above a hive city, not in the open void, not in any of the grand theatrical locations that the galaxy's various powers used for dramatic arrivals. It opened in an access corridor, 3 levels below the prophets of the Sevenfold Wound's primary coven spire, in a passage used primarily by maintenance racks and the occasional ambitious Hellion gang, cutting through from the lower district. And through it came a single figure in dark armor, landing in a controlled roll, coming to his feet in a combat stance before the breach had finished sealing, and beginning his assessment of the corridor with the speed and purpose of something that had spent its entire life entering hostile environments without warning. Velixar watched this on his monitoring apparatus for 4 full seconds. 4 seconds, for a being of his age and precision, was a long time to spend simply watching. Then he reached for his vox bead. "Retrieve the specimen," he said. His voice carried the specific quality of a man who has not used urgency in so long that he has forgotten its cadence. Alive, every bone intact. Bruce Wayne had prepared for many things. He had prepared for assassination attempts on 6 continents and a 7th that technically did not appear on public maps. He had prepared for nerve agents, explosive decompression, weaponized fear gas deployed by a man he had once called a teacher, and every variant of chemical and biological attack his applied sciences team could catalogue. He had prepared files on every known metahuman threat and spent 10,000 hours ensuring that each file had a corresponding response ready to be implemented without hesitation. He had prepared for the worst-case scenarios his imagination could generate, and his imagination was very good at worst-case scenarios. He had not imagined Commorragh. The corridor where he landed was 6 meters wide and carved from a material that was not stone and was not metal, and registered on his cowl's sensors as bioluminescent and of indeterminate organic origin. The light it produced was the color of a bruise approximately 3 days old. The smell was one his cowl's chemical sensors began cataloging and then stopped cataloging because 17 of the compounds it identified had no reference in any database he had ever loaded, and the 17th triggered a hazard alert because its molecular structure bore a resemblance to the byproduct of advanced necrotic tissue refinement at industrial scale. His first full assessment ran in 11 seconds. Breathable atmosphere, consistent gravity, no immediate threats in visual range, no obvious exits other than the passage ahead. Temperature cold. The compass was providing readings that were technically accurate and meaningless, because the geometry of the space seemed to curve in ways that made cardinal directions a courtesy rather than a guide. His second assessment ran in the next 11 seconds. This was not any known infrastructure. This was not any architecture in any database he carried. The bioluminescence was biological. The vibrations through the walls were rhythmic and came from multiple sources at varying distances, some close enough to be in the structure itself, and some so distant they could be ambient city noise. The floor was slightly tacky in a way that his suit's tread analysis flagged as intentional rather than incidental. He was in a city of some kind. He was in a specific facility within that city. The facility was designed for maintenance of things that needed to be maintained, and the things that needed to be maintained were organic, and the organic things were alive, and the sounds coming through the walls were the ambient output of whatever those things were doing. The third assessment began when he heard the wings, not feathers, something rigid, manufactured for efficiency, cutting the air with the precision of a hunting implement rather than a natural limb, multiple sources. His count ran to between 7 and 11 in the first 3 seconds and stopped being precise when the number kept climbing. Closing from behind, from the direction the breach had been, he did not look back. He ran for the curve in the corridor, hit the wall at pace, went up it with the technique he had developed for the older buildings in Gotham where the stonework offered purchase that glass and steel did not. The ceiling was 20 meters up. He reached 12 meters and stopped, flattening against the wall in the shadow between 2 arc lanterns. The Hellion gang that rounded the corridor bend was comprised of 16 riders on skyboards, and their captain was a Drukhari named Kethris the Bloodspark, who had been running the lower corridors of this district for long enough to know that empty corridors did not stay empty, and that shadows in a homunculus's facility were specifically not to be trusted. He slowed his board, his pack slowed around him. He looked at the empty passage. He looked at the shadows between the arc lanterns. He pulled a plasma grenade from his coat. The batarang that removed it from his hand came from the shadow above him at a speed his reflexes registered approximately 0.4 seconds after the relevant events had already occurred. It struck the grenade at the precise angle to send it tumbling 23 meters back down the corridor before it detonated. The detonation killed 2 riders outright and sent 3 more sliding into the walls on their boards with the impersonal violence of physics applied to inadequate preparation. In the silence after the explosion, Kethris could hear nothing. Then he could hear everything, which was worse: boards righting themselves, his riders reassessing, the distant ambient noise of the city, unchanged, uninterested. He felt a hand on the back of his neck with the specificity of something that knew exactly where to put it. Then he felt nothing at all. Batman used the next 2 hours and 47 minutes the way he used every environment he had not prepared for, which was by preparing for it as he moved through it. He mapped what he could see. He catalogued what he could not. He identified 6 additional patrol routes by sound before he encountered them visually. He found 3 structural anomalies that suggested maintenance access points and tested one of them, which led him 30 meters into a conduit before the conduit reached a junction sealed by a field that his suit's sensors registered and could not get past. He burned through 4 batarangs, 2 smoke pellets, 1 grapnel charge, and a significant portion of his remaining adhesive foam, disabling and evading the patrol units that Kethris's gang had been the advance element of. He was collected at the 3-hour mark by a shadow wire net deployed by a combined unit of 4 Hellion packs that had coordinated their approach without using any communication channel his cowl could detect. The shadow wire constricted on bioelectric fields. His suit's capacitors discharged twice before the field overwhelmed them, and the wire finished closing. He felt the cold with specificity, and then nothing at all. He woke in a chamber the size of a cathedral transept with his wrists suspended in magnetic binding rings 3 meters off the floor. His utility belt hung in a glass-fronted display rack 6 meters away, lit from within, every compartment visible and every component untouched. He noted this immediately. He noted it before he noted anything else, because it was the most important piece of information available. His captor had assessed his equipment and chosen not to open it. That was either supreme confidence or supreme caution, and a captor who demonstrated either quality at the first opportunity was not a captor who could be underestimated. He began his assessment of the chamber. He gave himself 12 minutes before the next significant event arrived, and he was accurate within 2. Velixar Kane walked through the door exactly 14 minutes after Bruce Wayne regained consciousness, preceded by 4 grotesqueries that moved on surgically repositioned limbs for reasons that were aesthetic rather than functional. The homunculus was tall in the Drukhari fashion, attenuated, his flesh the color of old parchment stretched over a frame that had been modified so many times across so many centuries that what remained of its original architecture was theoretically recoverable, but practically irrelevant. He wore a coat of materials that Batman's suit flagged and then declined to categorize. His eyes were amber and very old, and regarded Batman with the precise attention of a specialist who has spent 300 years waiting for a specific problem and has just found it. He did not speak immediately. He circled Batman 3 times, examining each angle with systematic deliberateness, consulting a data slate and comparing it to what he observed. He paused at the utility belt display for 38 seconds. He paused at Batman's gauntlets for longer. He examined the cowl's structure with the focused interest of someone who understood what it was doing before being told. "No augmentations detectable at the cellular level," he said finally. His language was not English. Batman's cowl reached it through a deep archive function installed after the first confirmed contact with entities claiming non-Earth origin. The translation was approximate but functional. No gene crafting, No psychic signature of any degree. No implanted weapons systems beyond what I can see. He tilted his head. No mechanical replacement components. No subdermal armor. No neurochemical modification. He looked at Batman. You are entirely biological. Batman said nothing. Velixar seemed to find this more interesting than a response. He made a notation on his data slate. I have in my collection, Velixar continued, settling into a seat with the ease of someone who has not needed to hurry in a very long time, an orc knob who has been with me for 40 years and still generates full metabolic aggression signatures. I have a tyrannid warrior, separated from its hive mind for 11 years, whose adaptations to isolation have provided more data than most of my other specimens combined. I have an Astartes. A brief pause. He no longer responds. His amber eyes return to Batman. What I do not have, in 3 centuries of collection, is an unmodified, unaugmented, psychically inert mortal human, not one who survived 3 hours in these corridors, and, in surviving, eliminated 1 Hellion captain and damaged 7 additional riders. Not one whose cortisol readings spiked and then returned to a baseline I have not previously recorded in any organic nervous system under equivalent stress conditions. He leaned forward slightly. Your hands did not shake, he said. Not once in 3 hours. What are you? Someone who's been in worse places, Batman said. Velixar looked at him for a long moment. Then he made another notation. That, he said, is precisely what I intend to test. He stood. He nodded at the grotesqueries, who had not moved and would not move, and left through the door that sealed behind him, with the specific sound of a decision that had already been finalized. Batman let the silence hold for 30 seconds. He used the time to breathe deliberately, and do what he had always done, in every unfamiliar confinement, on every unfamiliar continent, in every situation that his preparation had not specifically anticipated. He began building the only thing that had ever gotten him out of anything. Not a plan, not yet, an understanding. The diagnostic observation period lasted 4 days. Velixar arrived each morning for a 2-hour session and asked questions in the register of a researcher who has found an interesting problem and is not inclined to rush the findings. Food arrived through a sealed aperture at irregular intervals, water separately. The grotesqueries changed shifts at 12-hour marks and were never absent. Batman answered some of Velixar's questions. He answered the ones that cost nothing to answer and that built, in the homunculus's mind, a profile that was accurate in its details and misleading in its architecture. He described Gotham City with precision. He explained his training in general terms. He confirmed that he had no powers, no modifications, and no augmentation, all of which was precisely true. He offered these truths with the composure of a man who had decided that controlled transparency was more strategically useful than stonewalling, because stonewalling told his captor that the withheld information was worth protecting, while controlled transparency told his captor that the information was simply available, which redirected Velixar's focus toward what was not being said. On the 4th day, Velixar had a door cut in the wall, connecting Batman's chamber to the habitation corridor. You will have access to the corridor and to the gymnasium beyond it, at intervals I will specify, Velixar said. He framed it as enrichment. He meant it as experiment. Specimens who remain static deteriorate. The quality of data from a deteriorating specimen drops at a rate I find unsatisfying. How generous, Batman said. How illuminating, Velixar replied. The habitation corridor was 4 meters wide and 50 meters long, lit by the same bruise light as everywhere else. 6 cells opened off it. There was an orc who had stopped fighting in the specific way of something that has had every viable outlet for fighting removed, until fighting itself has become an abstraction. There was something in the 3rd cell that moved in multiple directions at once, and that Batman could not look at directly without his cowl's optics compensating for what his eyes were trying to tell his brain. There were others. There was, in the last cell on the left, a woman sitting cross-legged on the floor, dressed in colors that should not have worked together and did, wearing an expression of perfect serenity that was, in context, more alarming than anything else in the corridor. She was Aeldari, not Drukhari. The distinction mattered in the same way that the distinction between a sword and a dagger matters, not in the category, but in the specific nature and deployment. She was watching Batman with eyes that were smiling while her mouth remained entirely still. A mask lay on the floor beside her, blank and perfect. "You are later than I expected," she said. Her language, the cowl, reached easily, and the translation had a quality to it that suggested the speaker had designed her words to be understood. "You expected me," Batman said. "I expected someone," she said. The story required an arrival of this particular type, a mind of this particular discipline. She studied him with the frank appraisal of someone who reads people the way an archivist reads documents. Stubbornness married to intelligence, in the specific ratio I am looking at, is rare across any of the 37 species I have personally encountered, in combination with the talent you appear to have for making yourself disappear inside environments that should not allow it. A pause. "Velixar collected you well. He does not yet know how well. Who are you?" Batman said. "Ylthis," she said, "a shadow seer, of the mask of the shattered thread, an entertainer, of a kind, and a keeper of stories, and at present, a guest of this coven, using the word guest, with whatever flexibility the situation requires. How long?" 3 months. I was taking a route through the webway when Velixar's collection team intercepted me. I allowed it, because the item I came to retrieve requires access to levels of this coven spire that a harlequin cannot reach through the front approach. Her eyes moved briefly to the mask on the floor and back. Velixar is many things. He is not simple. He understands that the mask of the shattered thread would not permanently lose one of its shadow seers without consequence, and so the arrangement has been one of mutual observation, which suits me and suits him, and has left me with more access than a prisoner and less than a guest. "You've been watching the facility," Batman said. "For 3 months," she said. "Yes." Her expression finally reached its smile. "And then you arrived, which was the piece the story required." "What piece?" "The piece," she said carefully, "that Velixar has not accounted for. Every specimen he has collected, he has catalogued within 72 hours. Every capability identified, every limit mapped, every behavioral tendency modeled. He is very good at this. He has had a very long time to become good at it." She looked at Batman. "He has never collected a mortal human, an unaugmented, unpsychic, unmodified mortal human who fights through pure technique and preparation, and who has spent a professional lifetime studying how intelligent people think. He has mapped you as a biological curiosity. He has not fully grasped what you are doing to him." "Which is?" Batman asked. "The same thing he is doing to you," Ylthis said, "only faster." She met his eyes. "He has a resonator," she said. 3 levels above us. It is not finished. It has been under construction for 16 months, calibrated to a specific dimensional address. The address is the facility where your accident originated." She paused. "Your world, your city. He intends to open a passage large enough for a raiding fleet. He has been waiting for the mapping to be precise enough. Your arrival provided the final calibration data he needed. The silence that followed had a specific quality." Batman looked at the mask on the floor beside Ylthis, then at Ylthis, then at the 40 meters of corridor between him and the door to his cell. "How long until the resonator is ready?" he said. "The rate of completion I have observed suggests 3 to 4 weeks. What do you need to get the mask and get out?" he said. "Access to the resonator level," she said, "which I do not currently have, and an exit route through the webway that does not pass through any corridor Velixar controls." She tilted her head. "Which I can provide, if someone gives me the time and cover to open it. And you think I can give you that?" "I think," Ylthis said, "that you are already planning to. The question is whether you are willing to share the plan, which would be more efficient than us each planning independently and colliding at a critical moment." Batman looked at her for a long moment. "Tell me everything you know about the facility layout," he said. She told him. It took the rest of the access period and parts of the next 3 days, communicated through the wall between their cells in sounds low enough that the monitoring equipment would not flag them. She knew the Coven Spire's general architecture from her 3 months of observation. She knew the resonator's position. She knew the location of the webway access point she had identified as the extraction route. She did not know what stood between their current position and any of these things in the specific detail that would allow a plan to be built from it, but she had enough that Batman could build a framework, and a framework was what he had been waiting for. He began working. Working, in the context of a magnetic suspension chamber with no accessible materials, meant using what the environment provided rather than what had been removed from him. His cowl continued to run on its power cell, which had been at 73% when he arrived, and now read 61. His gauntlets retained the electric capacitors in their knuckles, which Velixar's collection team had not disabled because they had not been able to identify them as distinct from the gauntlet structure. He had 2 batarangs tucked into the seam of his body armor rather than the belt, which was why they had not gone into Velixar's display case. He had a fiber cord extracted from the inner lining of his cape during his 2nd day in the chamber, and he had 13 days of learning the monitoring equipment's scan intervals, the grotesqueries' response times, Velixar's behavioral patterns, and the precise location of every structural element in his chamber that could be used as a tool if it became necessary to think of it as one. He also had something that no catalogue of objects or capabilities could fully account for: the specific approach of a man who had spent his entire career preparing for problems he had not yet encountered, which is to say a mind in the permanent habit of asking what he was missing and what the environment around him was not yet telling him. On the 7th day of captivity, he had his framework. On the 8th day, he identified the gap. On the 10th day, he acted. The escape took 19 minutes from the moment he discharged the gauntlet capacitors against the magnetic binding ring's frequency node to the moment the shadow wire net closed around him again in the outer sanctum, 40 meters from what he had been told was the exit. It was not a failure. It was a recalibration conducted under field conditions, which was a more expensive kind of information than anything that could be learned from observation alone. He had gotten out of the chamber in 4 minutes. He had bypassed the grotesqueries in another 3, using the smoke pellet to generate a thermal displacement in the corridor that confused their heat-tracking sensors long enough to reach the maintenance shaft Thresh had indicated from the diagram. He had moved through the shaft with Ylthis for 8 minutes, reaching a position 11 meters from the outer sanctum exit before the lights changed. The lights changing meant the outer sanctum's alert status had changed. It had changed because Velixar had changed it, which meant Velixar had known. Batman had kept moving because the alternative to moving forward was moving backward, and the maintenance shaft behind him had already been sealed. He had reached the outer sanctum with Ylthis and found 6 Drukhari warriors in armor he had not seen before, positioned at intervals that reflected specific knowledge of where he would come from. What followed was not clean and was not brief, and was not anything he would have chosen in a controlled engagement. He fought in the outer sanctum for 4 minutes and 11 seconds with 2 batarangs, the fiber cord, and the electric discharge from the gauntlets, which he had been conserving. He disarmed 3 warriors with the batarangs, 2 of which he recovered. He used the cord to take a 4th off his feet. He put the 5th through a viewport with a palm strike that used the warrior's own momentum and the geometry of the space rather than superior strength, because he did not have superior strength against an opponent in powered armor, and fighting through geometry rather than force was the first thing he had learned about enemies with physical advantages. The viewport shattered. The 5th warrior fell 3 levels into the machinery below, which caught him with the impersonal efficiency of an environment that considers its occupants components. The 6th warrior hit him in the right shoulder with an agonizer blade that was not moving fast enough to penetrate the armor, but was moving with enough power to transfer force through it, and the force connected with something that protested loudly, and then went on protesting for the remainder of the evening. He reached the sealed exit. 4 seals, all new. From a Vox unit in the ceiling, Velixar's voice arrived, entirely calm. The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th exits are also sealed, Velixar said. The 5th exit, which you did not identify as an exit, returns to the habitation corridor. I would recommend using it. Batman stood at the sealed corridor in the dark with his shoulder making specific requests and the distant sound of Commorragh operating at its standard 30 million soul volume below him. He thought about the 5 sealed exits. He thought about the precision of the trap, which had not attempted to overwhelm him, but had simply closed the space around the path his models had predicted. He thought about the 6 warriors who had been positioned not to stop him but to slow him, to measure him, to observe how he performed against opponents with physical advantages in a space with no room for the misdirection he relied on in open environments. He thought about what it meant to fight an opponent who was not trying to defeat him, but to understand him, who treated every engagement as data, who was learning from the engagement precisely as Batman was learning from it, and who had perhaps been learning for longer. He used the 5th exit. "You learn quickly," Velixar said, when Batman returned to his chamber. His amber eyes held the specific light of a researcher who has received a result that confirms and improves his model simultaneously. "You overestimated yourself by 6 hours, Batman said. "That's the gap between what you can predict and what I'll actually do. Everything I do from now on will be in that gap." Velixar was quiet. "Yes," he said finally, "so it appears." He left. Batman held the silence for a moment. He had been recaptured. He had learned the outer sanctum's layout, the armor type of the guards, the response time of the sealed exits, and the precise point at which Velixar's predictive model of his behavior reached its limits. He had also confirmed that Yilthis was capable of moving through a maintenance shaft at the pace required to reach the resonator level in the time available. He had been recaptured. He had not failed. He noted the difference and began revising. The gymnasium was where Velixar maintained his specimen's functional capacity, and where Batman first met Zarathu. She was not a prisoner in the sense he was. She was a witch cultist, a champion of the cult of the Crimson Tide, stationed in the Coven Spire under an arrangement between her cult and the prophets of the Sevenfold Wound, while a political dispute resolved itself over the course of months. Her body had been refined over a century and a half of arena combat into something that occupied the mathematical intersection of beauty and maximum applied violence, and she regarded Batman across the gymnasium floor on his first access day with the flat assessment of someone who has spent her entire life grading opponents. "Velixar thinks you are interesting," she said. "I know," Batman said. "I disagree," she said. "What you are is limited. Mortal strength, mortal reflexes, mortal endurance. In the Crucible, you would not survive a full rotation." "Probably not," Batman agreed. She looked at him with an expression that said agreement was not what she had been expecting, and that the absence of the expected defensiveness was itself a kind of data point. "You disarmed 3 Kabbalite warriors in powered armor, with techniques you adapted in real time to armor you had never encountered before," Batman said. "Not because you were there, because Velixar's monitoring equipment recorded it, and you reviewed the recording, because you assess everything in this facility that could affect the political landscape, and you do this because you are going to be here for another 13 months, and you need to know what changes." He looked at her directly. "You're not in here because you're a prisoner. You're in here because your cult's arrangement required it. You'll leave when the arrangement concludes. But in 13 months, a lot can change, and one of the things that could change is that Velixar completes a resonator that opens an exclusive raiding ground no other Cabal or Coven knows about, which restructures Commorragh's political landscape in a direction that has specific implications for arrangements that your cult currently depends on." Zarathu's expression did not move, but something behind her eyes moved. "What do you want?" she said. 3 minutes of distraction," he said, "at a specific time and location that costs you nothing you care about and changes your 13-month calculation significantly." "How significantly?" "Archon Ysendra has been looking for a reason to move against the prophets of the Sevenfold Wound for 18 months, Batman said. "If I give her that reason at the right moment, the political dispute your cult's arrangement is contingent on resolves in a direction that ends your 13 months early." Zarathu looked at him for a very long time. The look of someone revising a model. "When?" she said. "I'll tell you when I know," he said. She turned away from him, conversation over, by the economy of someone who does not waste motion. But she had not said no. In the specific currency of Commorragh, not no was a binding agreement, because the alternative to honoring it was the loss of something more valuable than the agreement itself. Thresh was harder. The rack had been human once, in the same philosophical sense that a demolished building, rebuilt from different materials, in a different configuration, is still the original building. He communicated through gesture and sound and occasional marks scratched in the condensation of the chamber walls, because Velixar had spent several experimental years investigating whether language survived specific modifications, and the answer had turned out to be approximately half of it. What Thresh retained fully was spatial memory. The Coven Spire's internal architecture was mapped in him with the precision of something that had spent years moving through it in ways that did not require conscious navigation. He knew where the power conduits ran. He knew where the maintenance junctions were. He knew the resonator's location. He had shown Batman the layout in condensation diagrams on the wall between their cells, in fragments over 5 days of careful communication, because Batman had spent those 5 days learning his vocabulary as precisely as he had ever learned any language he needed to function in a new environment. On the day Batman asked him about the resonator's fail-safe junction, a thing Ilthis had identified in her description of the construction phase, Thresh had gone very still. Then he scratched the diagram again, in more detail than he had used before, and he underlined a specific point on the power conduit twice, and beside that point he drew a symbol. Batman looked at it. His pattern recognition identified it in approximately 2.4 seconds as a circuit breaker equivalent, a fail-safe junction, the kind an engineer places between a power source and a system storing enough energy to destroy its own containment, because even the builders of catastrophic things do not always want to go up with their experiments. If the resonator lost power at that junction specifically, it would not detonate. It would not release its stored energy. It would simply stop. And the 16 months of calibration it represented would have to start again. Batman looked at the diagram, at Thresh, at the distance from their current position to the junction, and the route through the maintenance shaft that avoided the outer sanctum entirely. "Can you get me to that junction without going through the outer sanctum?" he said. Thresh looked at the diagram, then at Batman, then at the diagram again. He scratched one mark into the condensation. Yes, the Crucible summoned them on the 11th day. The notice arrived not as request, but as fact. Selected specimens were to participate in a demonstration in the Coven Spire's arena. Velixar framed it as enrichment. The Crucible was the Prophet's private arena, seated at the base of the spire, where the arc lanterns gave way to the cold glow of the webway walls directly. It held perhaps 200 observers. It was not the civic spectacles of Commorragh's great arenas. It was intimate, focused, designed for the precise examination of specific interactions rather than the broad entertainment of the masses. Velixar brought 4 specimens: the Orc, who had been in the facility long enough that the opportunity for violence visibly reorganized everything in its physiology that had gone inert, the thing from Cell 3, on a containment scaffold. Ilthis, who descended into the arena with the serenity of someone who knows which page of the story they are on, and Batman. What awaited them was not other specimens. What awaited them was a Kronos parasite engine. The Kronos was one of Velixar's own constructions, a war engine assembled from homunculus artistry and the fundamental principle of stolen life. It moved on 4 articulated legs that could reconfigure between 3 and 2 depending on the terrain it was crossing, and its forward appendages ended in vortex extractors designed to drain the vital force from organic tissue within their reach. It stood 4 meters tall at the shoulder and moved with the patient, mechanical deliberateness of something that has been built to outlast everything it encounters. The Orc attacked it within 3 seconds of the Crucible doors opening. This was the Orc being the Orc, which was to say doing the only thing it had been doing since it arrived, and that Velixar's experimental environment had not been able to fully suppress. The Kronos knocked the Orc aside with a single appendage sweep and turned its sensor array toward the next target. Batman was not where the Kronos' targeting system expected him to be. He had used the 3 seconds of the Orc's engagement to move to the arena wall and go up it. The arena's surface was carved stone, that offered purchase in the specific fashion of the older structures in Gotham's financial district, and he was at 9 meters before the Kronos completed its targeting recalibration. The vortex extractors swept the floor space he had occupied. They found nothing. The Kronos extended its sensor range. Batman moved again, dropping from the wall while the range extension was processing, crossing 22 meters of arena floor at a sprint, and driving both gauntlet capacitors into the junction between the Kronos' primary leg assembly and its main chassis. The discharge was not sufficient to stop the Kronos. Batman had not expected it to be. He had expected to learn what the discharge could do against this specific type of construction, and he learned it. It stalled the primary leg assembly for approximately 1.1 seconds and caused the Kronos' balance compensation systems to overcorrect. He used the overcorrection to put 2 meters between himself and the appendage that swung through the space where he had been, and then the appendage's vortex field caught his right arm in passing, not a direct hit, a field edge contact, and the extraction began before he pulled his arm clear. His right arm hurt in a way that was specific and attentive for the remainder of the engagement. He spent the next 9 minutes mapping the Kronos. He mapped it the way he had always mapped opponents with physical advantages he could not match directly, not by engaging until he found the edge of their capacity, but by engaging precisely enough to collect data while sustaining as little cost as possible. He tracked the Kronos' movement patterns. He tracked its sensor sweep intervals. He tracked the recovery time between appendage strikes and the specific angle of limitation in its forward left sensor arc, where the vortex extractor's housing created a blind spot 23 degrees wide. He tracked the cycling interval of the 3 ventilation ports in its chassis, which opened to dissipate heat from its internal power cell at intervals he timed across 9 minutes of engagement. He also watched where Ylthis was in every second of those 9 minutes, and ensured that the Kronos' attention tracked him rather than her. The Orc attacked the Kronos 6 more times in that 9-minute window. The Kronos knocked it aside with decreasing energy each time, because the Orc was forcing the Kronos to use its appendages in ways that were burning through the power cell at a rate its designers had not fully accounted for. Batman logged this. He logged everything. On the 9th minute, he had what he needed. He waited for the Orc's 7th charge. The Orc, obliged with the boundless commitment of a thing that has decided a specific target needs to be addressed, and that no evidence to the contrary will change this. In the 2.8 seconds the Kronos was processing the Orc's impact, Batman crossed the arena floor, scaled the Kronos' chassis from its rear, pulled the remaining fiber cord from his cape, and waited. The left rear ventilation port opened at its interval. He dropped the cord through it. The cord's end had been treated with a compound he had spent the last 3 days preparing using materials available in the gymnasium, and that Thresh had confirmed were chemically reactive with the casing of standard homunculus power cell construction. The compound reached the cooling system. The cooling system relayed to the cell. The cell's fail-safe protocol activated. The Kronos stopped, not catastrophically, with the quiet finality of a machine whose own internal logic has decided that stopping is safer than continuing. In the Crucible, the silence arrived like a physical presence. 200 Drukhari observers looked at the arena floor, at the stopped Kronos, at the figure standing on its chassis, cape shortened and right arm held with a specific carefulness that indicated something there was not fully working, looking back at them with the composure of a man who was waiting for the next thing. Velixar, in the elevated viewing box, made a notation. Batman looked at Ylthis across the arena. Her expression said, clearly and without words, that she saw what he was doing and agreed that the timing was not yet right. Not yet. He needed one more piece. He looked at the Kronos' forward appendages, at the vortex extractor housing, at the cables running from the extractors to the chassis, which were approximately 5 meters in length and made of a material his suit flagged as conductive in a specific and useful way. He spent 4 minutes removing one. The arena dismissal protocol moved specimens back to the habitation corridor under standard escort, 4 grotesqueries, 2 Cabalite guards. The route passed within 11 meters of the ventilation shaft that connected to the maintenance network Thresh had mapped. 11 meters was enough. On the dismissal route, 11 meters from the shaft access point, Zarathu of the Crimson Tide fell against a Kabbalite guard. Not hard, not convincingly. Precisely hard enough to trigger the guard's training response, which was to catch and stabilize the falling body, and the act of stabilizing required both hands, and in the 1.3 seconds that the guard's hands were occupied, Batman was 11 meters away, and then through the shaft access, and then no longer in the corridor at all. Ilthis followed 7 seconds later from a second angle she had identified during the arena dismissal movement. Thresh was already inside the maintenance network, waiting. Batman moved through the network toward the fail-safe junction with the Chronos cable in his right hand and his right arm working at approximately 70% of normal capacity, which was enough. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not clean. Velixar's monitoring systems flagged the habitation corridor's departure, and the alert cascade moved through the Coven Spire's response protocols faster than it had during the first escape attempt, because Velixar had revised his response protocols after the first escape attempt. 3 homunculus court guard teams were repositioned toward the maintenance network access points. They could not reach the fail-safe junction before Batman did, because Thresh knew routes they did not know were routes. Batman reached the junction. The resonator was 3 meters away, through a sealed aperture, visible through a viewport that Thresh had identified, and that Batman's cowl had confirmed carried a specific camera assembly in its frame. 16 months of construction. The hum of stored energy in a register that felt, physically, like being too close to a transformer substation. It was enormous. It was almost complete. The fail-safe junction was a contact point on the main power conduit, accessible through a maintenance panel that required no tools to open, because maintenance panels in any facility are always accessible to the things that maintain them. Batman connected the Chronos cable to the junction's contact points using the same reactive compound that had stopped the Chronos, which he had preserved a second application of specifically for this purpose. The resonator's hum did not change, it stopped. Silence where there had been a sound so constant it had become part of the environment's texture. 16 months of calibration, halted at the moment of its completion, without detonation, without destruction, with nothing more than a circuit breaker, doing what circuit breakers are designed to do. From above, through the maintenance network, Batman could hear the change in the Coven Spire's ambient noise, the quality of movement. The shift from routine patrol to directed response. Velixar's voice, distant, without specific words, in the register of a man who has understood what has happened and is performing extremely rapid calculations. "The junction," Ilthis said beside him. "Not yet," Batman said. He crossed to the cogitation bank nearest the resonator chamber viewport. He had 4 minutes before Velixar's response teams reached the maintenance network junction that could access this level. He needed 3. He accessed the documentation archive through the cogitation bank's external terminal, using the access pathway Thresh had shown him 3 days ago, and that Velixar had not reconfigured, because the pathway was a maintenance function, and Velixar had not flagged Batman as knowing it existed. He found Velixar's current communication logs. He found the full technical specifications of the resonator and the Sol system calibration data, and the security assessment of the Prophets of the Sevenfold Wound's current defensive posture. He found, in the political correspondence archive, 17 months of communications between Velixar and the Cabal of the Shattered Obsidian, communications that had stopped 4 months ago, and the reason they had stopped 4 months ago, and the specific nature of what Archon Ysendra had requested and what Velixar had declined to share. He sent the resonator specifications, the Sol system mapping, and the defensive assessment to Archon Ysendra of the Shattered Obsidian Cabal, using the communication address in the archived correspondence. He also sent the security assessment's timestamp, which was current, which meant the Prophet's defenses were at their current level, and Ysendra could verify this independently, which meant she would know the information was accurate, which meant she would act on it. Batman looked at the cogitation terminal for 1 moment. Commorragh ran on political leverage, on information as currency, and advantage as the only ethics. An Archon who received proof that a homunculus coven had been sitting on an exclusive new raiding ground, calibrated and mapped and almost operational, without sharing the information or the access, would have every political and practical incentive to move on it immediately, before the Coven could re-secure, before the information could reach anyone else. In the calculus of Commorragh, Velixar was about to have a problem considerably larger and more immediately threatening than one escaped specimen. Now, Batman said. Ilthis had the webway access open before he finished the word. She was a shadow seer, and the webway was her architecture, and the passage she opened did not connect to any exit Velixar had mapped, because it ran through a corridor of the webway older than the Coven Spire's construction, accessible only to those who carried the keys of Sigurach's keeping. The passage was pale and cold, and moved in a direction that was not a direction in any materium sense. Ilthis reached into the maintenance shaft behind her and retrieved, from the alcove where she had placed it 3 days ago, when she had last had access to the habitation corridor, the mask that Velixar had collected from her troop's vault, and that was the reason she had allowed herself to be here in the first place. She held it in both hands, and her expression was the complicated one, the one that was not quite relief, and not quite grief, and was the measured point between them. Thresh stood at the mouth of the passage. Batman looked at him. Thresh made a sound, then he made another. Then, for the first time in 12 days, he did not reach for the condensation on the wall. He looked at Batman directly. Batman had learned enough of what remained of Thresh's language to understand what the sounds meant. The first meant, "I cannot go through what is on the other side of this. I am too much what this place made me." The second meant, "This is the choice I am making." There was nothing to say in response to that which was both true and useful. Batman looked at Thresh for a long moment, the full measure of a moment, the kind that does not try to be anything other than what it is. "Thank you," he said. Thresh made a third sound, which Batman did not have a translation for yet, and which he suspected was the sound a person makes when they have done something by choice, and the choosing was enough. Batman followed Ilthis through the access point, the passage sealed. The webway between entry and exit had a quality of time that was not linear and was not circular, and was not any temporal property that a watch could measure. Batman moved through it with his eyes on Ilthis, and his focus on the point of light ahead that was, when they reached it and stepped through, the cold rain smell of a city in the very early hours of a morning that had not yet decided if it was going to be dark or light. Gotham. From the rooftop where they emerged, looking exactly as it always looked at 3 in the morning, lit from below and dark from above, and full of its ambient register of sound, which he had spent his entire life learning to read the way a musician reads a score, the particular geometry of the financial district skyline, the specific quality of the air that came off the river. He stood at the rooftop's edge and held it for a moment. "The resonator," Ilthis said. "Stopped," he said. "The sol calibration is gone. They have to start again. Years, at minimum, assuming Ysendra's forces give them the facility to start at all." Ilthis was quiet. She put the mask on for 3 seconds and then took it off, and her expression after she took it off was one he had not seen from her before, something very close to peace, the kind that comes from the specific completion of something that has been undone for too long. "You did not kill him," she said. "No," Batman said. "He will try again, in some form, in some time. That is what he does." "Yes," Batman said, "but not today, and not to this world." He looked at the city. "Today is enough." Ilthis looked at him with the eyes of someone who has witnessed 10,000 stories conclude, and who has learned the specific difference between the ones worth witnessing and the ones that merely happened. She was quiet for a long time. "The shadow seers of my mask would say you made the wrong choice," she said finally, "that the galaxy gave you the moment and you did not use it fully." "I know," Batman said. "You disagree. Not because it's easier," he said. "Not because it costs me less. Because what I'm doing is not about being more dangerous than my enemies. It's about being different from them. The moment I use the same methods, I've answered the question the wrong way, and the question is the only thing worth protecting." He looked at the city below. 10 million lights, 10 million choices, ongoing, compounding, some of them terrible, and some of them extraordinary, and most of them in the long middle, where people were simply trying to get through to the next thing. A city he had decided, in a cave when he was very young and very alone, to give his life to. Not because it was worthy of it in some cosmic accounting, because it was his, and he was still here, and the work had not ended. Yilthis looked at the mask in her hands, then at Gotham, then at Batman. "There is a story my troupe performs," she said slowly, "about whether the things required to survive something also change what you are, and whether the change makes the survival worth its cost." A pause. "I thought, when you arrived in Velixar's corridor, that I knew how it ended." She met his eyes. The impossible philosophy meets the impossible universe, and one of them breaks. A long silence. "I was wrong about which one." She stepped back into the webway, and the passage closed behind her without sound, and she was gone. Batman stood alone on the rooftop in the rain-cold air. His right shoulder had been damaged by the agonizer blade in the outer sanctum, and had been running on managed pain protocols since the arena engagement. His cape was 31 centimeters shorter than it had been. His utility belt carried 2 batarangs and no other functional resources. His cowl's power cell read 22%. He had been in Commorragh for 12 days. He thought about Thresh, who had stayed. He held the weight of that, the way he held all the weights he could not put down, because putting them down was not the same as resolving them. And he had learned a long time ago that the weights that could not be put down were not failures of management, but the specific cost of caring about what happened to people you could not always protect. He held it without trying to resolve it. He had learned to do that too. He looked at Gotham. He had spent 12 days in the darkest city that had ever existed in any universe, in a galaxy where darkness was not a metaphor and not a symbol, and not the kind of thing that a well-placed light could address. He had been collected by something ancient and patient and meticulous. He had walked out of it intact, and in doing so had stopped a passage being opened to his world that would have cost it more than he had the capacity to calculate. He had done it without killing anyone, not because the philosophy was convenient, not because the cost was small, because what he was required it, and he was still what he was. 12 days in a city built entirely on the proposition that everything, given sufficient time and pressure, will break. He had not broken. Below him, the city moved, ordinary crimes in ordinary streets, the continuous ongoing work of a world that did not know what had almost reached it. The sirens in the mid-distance, the precise 3-tone sequence from the 3rd Precinct's communications tower that meant a pursuit in progress near the docks, the kind of thing that would take approximately 17 minutes to reach on foot, and 12 by rooftop if someone were already moving. He reached into the inner lining of his shortened cape and found what he had placed there on the first day in Velixar's facility, in the same reflex that had kept 2 batarangs off his belt, a secondary grapnel line, the emergency reserve, habit so deep it operated without decision. He attached it to the rooftop's edge. He looked at the city that was his, the city that was still there, the work that had not ended and would not end, and that he had chosen, a very long time ago, to give his life to. In the grim darkness of the far future, where 10,000 screaming species burned against each other across a galaxy that had made brutality into theology and suffering into sacrament, there existed a city in another universe that a single mortal man had decided to make the object of his one life. A city he had entered and exited and returned to through every catastrophe that had tried to separate him from it. In Commorragh, 30 million souls were still screaming in the dark. On a rooftop in Gotham, one man counted those he could not save, held the count without flinching, and jumped. He had a city to get back to.